some people in Corinth have questioned the resurrection. And so Paul writes to them to answer their questions, but to make a case for the resurrection, both of Jesus and of all people. And so I'm going to read the first two verses and then the 58th verse to bring what I gave you in the prep guide into play before we kind of move much further. Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel, you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. And then a lot of stuff happens. 3 through 57 happen between of the verses. But let's see where he goes at the very end, which will probably tell us what Paul hopes he's going to get done with this very long chapter and very long argument. Because the last verse of chapter 58 goes like this: Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Notice the stand repeat. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. So, in the prep guide, I mentioned to you and kind of went to some length to show what I think is happening and why Paul waits all the way to the end of his letter to bring up the resurrection, which must have been for him even more important than the incest case or the lawsuits or how a marriage goes equal or tilted or meat sacrifice to idols or even the handling of female prophets who don't have a covering on their head, right? I'm being a little facetious, but Paul would have thought this is a primary issue. So why does he wait till chapter 15 to discuss the resurrection and address their diffidence about it or their ambivalence about it? Well, I mentioned in the prep guide, and I'll repeat now, something that you may have noticed along the way, and we have noted from time to time along the way, which is that in Paul's First Corinthians, unlike a couple of his other letters, unlike Philippians, for instance, in which there's praise at almost every turn for those great Philippians who have been so good to Paul and all those things, uh, or the Thessalonians who are new to this, and Paul gives them all kinds of kudos and grace. Here he has a pretty steady corrective exhortation. Time after time, he's trying to move them from circling around themselves and their own rights and considerations and move them to a deference to others that he thinks is central to people who live by the logic of the cross. Remember, way back in chapter 1, Paul said, You're criticizing my preaching. I preach in alignment with the cross. I try to mimic, not only do I accept Jesus's salvation that comes through the cross, I think the cross is also an ethical formation vehicle. That is, it reminds us that Jesus was for us and should remind us that we ought to be for others. So, from the very first chapter, Paul has been sounding out his hope that he can move the Corinthians out of the center of their universe so that they defer to others and they think about the community before themselves. That happens in 5 when he says, You all are complacent and there's somebody among you who's sleeping with his father's wife. You need to think outside what's going on with you and think to what's best for the community, which right now would be to get that kind of behavior out of play. We spent some time on that when we were in 5. Then in 6, you're suing one another. The arbor vitae is on one side of the property line or another, and you take it to Roman courts. Why are you so concerned for yourself? You're harming, and you're harming people for whom Christ died. Notice the cross showing up again. Then in 7, he wants them to think about the gospel. He even goes so far as to say, it'd be great if you were single like I am, because then you'd have more time for the gospel, but I don't think you're up to it in a land of sexual immorality. So go ahead and marry, but your first consideration ought to be what's good for the gospel. In 8, I know you have a right to eat meat. Give it up for the brothers and sisters who will be scandalized you if you eat meat. Christ died for them too. In 11, there's this deference that's called on at the communion table, at the evening love feast that they had together. There are some people eating all the food and leaving nothing for the folks who come later and probably aren't as well fed. In 12, it's not about you. It's not about your ecstasy or the thing you like to watch. It's about hearing edifying words and giving out edifying words. That's why prophecy is better than tongues unless you have an interpreter. See, time after time through this letter, Paul has said, sacrifice for the good of the other, sacrifice for the good of the gospel. And that's a lovely thing, except it's also a great burden. He's calling on people to not serve themselves primarily. Now that doesn't land really well in a me first self-esteem ethos in 21st century America, United States either. But think about those Corinthians now. He's been telling them to give things up for 14 chapters. And now he gets to the place where he will say, if there is no resurrection, I, who have been giving myself up for you and others for years, I am the most to be pitied because I am banking on resurrection as the proper ending for someone who lives the life of the cross. Does that make sense? So Paul gives himself as an example there, but he's trying to persuade them that resurrection, if they do the life that he has laid out for them in this whole letter, resurrection is sort of the welcome version of well done, good and faithful servant. And so that's why I believe it's positioned last, even though for him it is primary concern. So with that in mind, in this one I have on the screen, he's tried to persuade them, used 57 verses to persuade them that resurrection happened not only of Jesus, but will happen of all of us. Therefore, since there is a resurrection, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm, let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord that I've just told you in 14 chapters, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. If there's no resurrection, he says, your faith is in vain and my work is in vain. But here, if you actually accept that Jesus rose and all of humanity will rise, and that will come as a sort of answer to your self-sacrificial living, then your labor will not be in vain. Okay, so that's a broad picture of how I think Paul is trying to get them home, trying to make them aware that the resurrection matters to them and that believing in it is a proper way of responding to the gospel.